There are few, if any, visionaries in the gaming space whose names carry as much cachet and weight as Hideo Kojima's. Video games aren't movies, and one of the major differences between the industries is that while everyone in the world knows the big name directors in film, be it Tarantino, Scorsese, Nolan, Kubrick, or Cameron, I'd bet that most players don't know who directed many of their favourite games. Sure, I think most gamers know a handful of notable game directors: Neil Druckmann, Cory Barlog, Shinji Mikami, Sam Lake, Hidetaka Miyazaki, but it's far rarer for an auteur to make a name for themselves in gaming. There truly is only one Hideo Kojima. He's such a cultural icon within the gaming community, and someone gamers are just drawn to and fascinated by. I mean, there's nobody else in this industry whose Twitter film reviews are eagerly anticipated for each new release like Kojima's are. And it's probably a good thing that this is a rare phenomenon, because most video games are huge collaborative projects with countless artists of every kind having a hand in their creation. But it's why when you get a figure like Kojima, they're so compelling. But while he's a beloved icon for many gamers, Kojima can also be a bit of a polarising figure. Some view him as a one-of-a-kind artistic genius, while others find his works convoluted and pretentious. Personally, I love Kojima. I think he's undeniably one of this industry's most creative minds. His complete willingness to lean into the absurd, with no concern about his wild ideas being perceived as too silly or outlandish, has led to some of the most memorable characters and moments in gaming. He's also an undeniably fascinating and charismatic character with a great stage presence. So I'm going to be there for anything Kojima Productions puts out on day one. With that being said, when it was announced, I wasn't sure how to feel about the idea of a Death Stranding 2. On one hand, I was excited to see more of this world and its characters, who I genuinely grew attached to throughout the first game. But I also felt like the original Death Stranding was a satisfying, complete story, so I didn't think it necessarily needed a sequel. However, after playing Death Stranding 2, damn did Kojima prove me wrong, as with Death Stranding 2, Kojima Productions has delivered a masterful sequel that improves on its predecessor in nearly every conceivable way, fully delivering on the promise of Death Stranding's ideas. Death Stranding 2 massively refines and expands the combat and stealth mechanics, offers infinitely better pacing than that of the original Death Stranding, which was always my major gripe with the game, and more exciting exploration thanks to Death Stranding 2's dynamic environmental disasters that add plenty of extra spectacle and danger to deliveries. Oh, and to top it all off, Death Stranding 2 might also be the best looking game I've ever played. While I have a couple of gripes with the writing and character motivations, as Sam occasionally makes out-of-character choices purely because they're required to set plot beats in motion, I still adored Death Stranding 2 as a whole, largely because Death Stranding 2 is Kojima at his least restrained and most creative. If Death Stranding was deeply strange, Death Stranding 2 is utterly fucking bonkers, and that won't be for everyone. I'm sure plenty would find Death Stranding 2 goofy or overly ostentatious, but if you can let the absurdity wash over you and allow yourself to get immersed in it, I promise you that Death Stranding 2 is one of the most original and unique gaming experiences you'll ever have. And if you're anything like me, you will absolutely love it. Especially if you're a fan of Kojima's prior games, as Death Stranding 2 has much more Metal Gear DNA than the original. Before we get into the review proper, I should probably let you know where I fell on the original Death Stranding, seeing as it is such a divisive game, so you know my mindset going into Death Stranding 2. While I do have my fair share of problems with it, I love the original Death Stranding. I think it's a very special game that can also be deeply frustrating, and it was fresh in my mind going into this review, as I had just replayed Death Stranding in the lead up to Death Stranding 2, as I wanted to refresh my memory of the story before diving into the sequel, as it had been about 6 years since I played it. This was also my first time playing through the director's cut version, and I've gotta say, I enjoyed Death Stranding even more upon revisiting it than I did the first time around. I can fully understand why many gamers did not enjoy Death Stranding, or found it to be boring. Its gameplay loop of delivering parcels will either click with you, and you'll find it oddly satisfying, or you'll be bored to tears. But it really scratches a specific itch for me. I found the experience of plotting out routes to most efficiently transport cargo through Death Stranding's treacherous terrain almost meditative, and it's certainly an incredibly unique experience. The central loop of Death Stranding is the puzzle of figuring out the best way to get cargo from point A to point B. It's a bizarre experience where you find fun in the little things, be it setting up a perfectly placed zipline that cuts out a perilous trek, or riding a cargo carrier down a mountain like a snowboard. But what impressed me the most in Death Stranding was its social elements, which felt truly revolutionary to me, and made Death Stranding an experience unlike any other. I had never experienced a sense of community in a single-player game like I did in Death Stranding. The way your life would be made infinitely easier when you stumbled across other players' structures, like bridges, roads, or even just a generator that saved your ass by recharging your bike's battery when you were in a pinch, and knowing that your creations were helping others in the same way as you saw the likes on objects you'd placed in the world grow over time is such a one-of-a-kind gameplay system. Despite playing by yourself, it felt like you were fulfilling your part in a true communal experience. At this point, I've played literally thousands of video games, and it's rare for me to experience something that feels truly new, but I can sincerely say that I've never experienced anything even remotely like Death Stranding before or since, and that holds a lot of weight for me. Of course, when fans talk about Kojima's games, one of the first things that comes up is the characters. The Metal Gear series is home to some of the most iconic and memorable characters in gaming, and with Death Stranding, Kojima lived up to this legacy. I love the cast of Death Stranding, and these characters are the perfect encapsulation of what makes Kojima's games so special. Kojima will come up with the wackiest idea for a character you've ever heard, then give them the most absurd, on-the-nose name imaginable. I mean, Death Stranding has characters called Die Hardman, Mama, Fragile, and Deadman, but play them completely straight. There are no stupid jokes about the naming conventions, and they're written and treated with complete sincerity, which is why it works. Kojima is unashamed of the ridiculous nature of his characters and tells their stories boldly and confidently, which leads to incredible concepts for characters that you wouldn't see in anyone else's games. Take Hartman, for example, who lives his life in 21-minute bursts, then stops his heart for 2 minutes to explore the beaches of the other side in search of his deceased wife and daughter. These characters were brought to life by an incredible roster of talent, including Mads Mikkelsen, Lea Seydoux, Margaret Qualley, and of course, Norman Reedus, who played our protagonist Sam Porter Bridges, who I know some players didn't like and found dull, as he can be quite monotone and dry, but I think his performance worked for Death Stranding. When every character surrounding him is so heightened and over the top, I actually like that Norman Reedus gave a more reserved performance and served as an anchor point to ground things a little. A story this outlandish needs a straight man. God, Kojima really is the only person who could wrangle such a massive lineup of names to bring this kind of eccentric idea to life in video game form. I truly loved Death Stranding's story and how much heart it had to offer underneath the absurdity, as we watched Sam's bond with Lou grow throughout the story. I think it's often overstated how convoluted and confusing the first Death Stranding story is. As odd as it may sound to say, about a game with babies in tanks that allow people to sense invisible monsters created from corpses, I actually think Death Stranding is one of Kojima's more straightforward stories. Certainly more so than something like Metal Gear Solid 4. If you're paying attention to what's happening in the cutscenes, I think the only times you'll really be lost are when the game wants you to feel that way. But by the time all is said and done, nearly all the questions you have will be resolved. Kojima and Ko's creativity extended well beyond the characters of Death Stranding, with its world being filled with wonderfully outlandish sci-fi concepts, like the timefall rain that ages anything it touches, blood grenades, BB pods, and piss mushrooms, all these weird concepts that could only come from the mind of Kojima. Death Stranding also established a fantastic visual identity of its own from the jump, as it once again saw Kojima working with his longtime artistic collaborator, Yoji Shinkawa, who is undoubtedly one of the greatest artists in this industry, with his designs for the costumes, BB pods, vehicles, right down to the odd, angular umbrella Fragile carries, being so striking. With all these positives said, there was certainly room for improvement with Death Stranding. The pacing was wildly uneven and could feel unnecessarily slow in the opening chapters, combat was somewhat wonky, and there were moments where it felt like Kojima was being a little overly indulgent, like the ridiculous credits sequence that drags on forever. So while I loved Death Stranding, I also think it's far from perfect. Thankfully, Kojima Productions was clearly aware of this, and most of these issues have been addressed and alleviated in Death Stranding 2. Now, as we transition to talking about Death Stranding 2, I do want to throw out a quick spoiler warning, as while I won't include any major story spoilers for Death Stranding 2, and won't describe in depth anything beyond what was shown in trailers for Death Stranding 2, there will be spoilers for the first Death Stranding, as even talking about where we left each of these characters at the end of the original Death Stranding inherently spoils that game. This also seems like a good segue into answering the most commonly asked question about sequels. Can you jump into Death Stranding 2 without playing the first game? And I'd say the answer is a pretty definitive no. Death Stranding is a story-driven experience with a very fleshed out world, and Death Stranding 2 assumes you know the events, character backstories, and terminology of the first Death Stranding. There is a previously on style recap in Death Stranding 2, but it's very brief and surface level, so it's meant to quickly jog the memory of returning players, not catch newcomers up. So I would not recommend touching Death Stranding 2 before finishing 1, as you're going to be missing out on so much important context. Okay, let's get into it, as I have a lot to say about Death Stranding 2, as you can probably tell by the runtime of this video, because if I love the first Death Stranding, I utterly adored Death Stranding 2, and I want to dive in by talking about the story. At the end of Death Stranding, Sam was tasked with destroying his BB tank as it had been labelled defective. But after forging an unbreakable bond with Lou throughout their adventure, he instead disobeys the order and chooses to remove Lou from her tank to save her life, fleeing to start a new life raising Lou. Death Stranding 2 picks up 11 months later and sees Sam and Lou, who's grown into a normal, healthy baby, living a simple, happy life off the grid, hiding out in a secret shelter to avoid detection from bridges. And you can immediately see how Sam's relationship with Lou has changed him for the better. He's a little less detached and more expressive, happier, and frankly, just more human. But one day, Sam and Lou's peaceful existence is called into question when an intruder is detected within their proximity, who turns out to be none other than Fragile. And as a side note, Fragile's entrance did make me chuckle, because she shows up in a motorcycle helmet, but it is so obviously Fragile based on the suit and body. Yet somehow, Sam cannot clock this, and is still standing there ready to whack her with a frying pan. Even after she removes her helmet and just has her face mask covering her mouth, it still doesn't click for him. It's like that scene in The Dark Knight where Harvey Dent can't tell the nurse is Joker until he removes the face mask. But Fragile isn't just popping in for a friendly visit. She has a proposal for Sam. A job for an organisation called Drawbridge, which would require him to connect Mexico to the chiral network. To further entice Sam to take on this job, Fragile tells him that completing this mission will reunite him with his old friend Deadman, but more importantly, will also earn him his freedom by getting his actions at the end of the first game pardoned by the UCA. However, she's a little more cagey when questioned about getting the same leniencies granted for Lou, saying that Lou was technically a Bridger's asset. Despite this, Sam accepts Fragile's mission, knowing that being a porter is what he does best, and that with the threat of BTs looming large over Mexico, he may well be the only person capable of completing this job. Even so, Sam's rapid acceptance of this job is one of the few points of contention I have with Death Stranding 2's story. I'm just not sure why Sam would be so willing to jeopardise the life he's built with Lou, and leave Lou with Fragile to go off on this mission. It feels like Sam's so quick to accept this, because it's what the story requires of Sam, even if it feels out of character. Death Stranding 2 implements occasional dialogue trees into the story, usually as a way to probe characters for more information, and dig a little deeper into the lore of this world and its inhabitants. And when Fragile asks Sam if he'll go to connect Mexico, I said no, because I feel like that's what Sam would say. Of course, the game won't let you progress if you refuse the mission that sets Death Stranding 2's plot in motion, but I'd still recommend refusing the mission a couple of times, because in traditional Kojima fashion, you do get a fun little joke for going against what the game wants you to do, like the time paradox screen you get if you try to kill Ocelot at the beginning of Metal Gear Solid 3. Nevertheless, Sam sets off for Mexico, which functions as the prologue/tutorial area for Death Stranding 2, with his brief detour to Mexico leading to Sam being roped into the main objective of Death Stranding 2, reconnecting my homeland of Australia. Because while porters aren't required to complete deliveries in America anymore, as Sam connecting the entire country to the chiral network has allowed for all deliveries to be automated and performed by machines from a company called APAS, rendering Bridges and Fragile Express defunct, that's far from true for the rest of the world. And while travelling to other continents was once a pipe dream, it's now been made possible due to the emergence of something called plate gates, connections that have formed between the continents that began emerging after Sam connected all of North America to the chiral network. Though these plate gates have also brought a new set of problems with them, as they're responsible for environmental disasters called plate quakes that are making the world increasingly unstable and treacherous to navigate, which has some major gameplay implications, but more on that later. I won't dive into the story beyond this, or the chain of events that lead us to Australia, because it's impossible to do so without spoiling things that are better experienced for yourself. On that note, it is crazy how deep into the game some of the shots in Death Stranding 2's trailers are pulled from. There are moments shown in Death Stranding 2's trailers that are legitimately from the final 10% of the game, but because they're completely devoid of context, they don't feel spoilery. This is something Kojima has long done. I remember the same being particularly true of the trailers for Metal Gear Solid 5 and the original Death Stranding. Being Australian, I was obviously intrigued by Kojima's choice to set Death Stranding 2 here, and I was excited to see Kojima's interpretation of a dystopian Australia. I was even more fascinated when I saw that Sam begins his journey through Australia in my literal home of Western Australia, and it was surreal seeing certain Aussie wildlife in Death Stranding 2. Very early on, there's a cutscene with some rainbow lorikeets, which immediately caught my eye. I see these birds in the trees around my house every single day, but I've certainly never seen them in a video game before, and I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a novelty to that for me. Saying that, this isn't a particularly recognisable rendition of Australia. The wildlife and the Australian accents of certain characters are the only way you'd really know this game is set in Australia without looking at the map. Don't expect to stumble across any iconic landmarks. You won't find Uluru or the remnants of the Sydney Harbour Bridge or Opera House. And Kojima Productions isn't trying to be even remotely accurate with the layout and topography of the map. In the real world, there are definitely no snowy mountain ranges in the centre of Australia. In fact, the centre of Australia is pretty barren and boring. I don't know if international viewers know this, but there's really nothing in the middle of Australia, as all the major Australian cities are located around the edges of the country, and more than 85% of people who live in Australia live within 50 kilometres of the coastline. From the jump, Death Stranding 2 establishes so many interesting plot threads, be it the question of who exactly is Strawbridge, and why do they want us to reconnect Australia, or what the deal is with the mysterious, cult-like figures Sam encounters at the start of the game, who we see roaming through the desert, cloaked in red hoods, marching by the hundreds. And of course, as this is a Kojima game, Death Stranding 2 goes to some wild places. One of the first trailers we saw for Death Stranding 2 featured a guitar-wielding Higgs duking it out with a cybernetic ninja, and that doesn't even scratch the surface of how outrageous Death Stranding 2 gets. Hey, at this point, you know whether you're into Kojima's brand of absurdity or not, and I live for this stuff. Though I should warn you that while at times goofy, Death Stranding 2 is also an extremely dark game, to the point that I was actually surprised that Kojima Productions was willing to go to the places they did. The first Death Stranding was incredibly melancholic, and had a pervasive sense of sadness to it. But Death Stranding 2 is truly fucking bleak, and grapples with some of the heaviest material imaginable. This is a story about grief, death, and the loss of human connection. Kojima has said that he had a story planned for Death Stranding 2 that he scrapped because he decided to rewrite the game after experiencing the pandemic in 2020. And you can see that in the writing, as Death Stranding 2 leans even further into the themes of isolation and the importance of human interaction than the first Death Stranding. And as a result, Death Stranding 2 provides an incredibly emotional and even moving experience. Christ, between Clair, Obscur and Death Stranding 2, it really has been a year of exceptionally well-made, but remarkably depressing games, huh? Overall, I adored the core story of Death Stranding 2, and it had me invested hook, line and sinker the entire way through, which is no small feat when you're talking about such a meaty experience. I was at just over 50 hours of playtime when I rolled credits on Death Stranding 2, but your playtime is going to be highly dependent on what you choose to do in the game. I'm sure you could finish Death Stranding 2 around the 30-hour mark if you just want to mainline the story, or you could easily spend well over 100 hours before finishing the game if you're trying to do everything. But while I loved the story of Death Stranding 2 and found it to be highly poignant, in fact, it's probably the most enraptured I've been with a video game story in 2025, I do have a few big gripes with Death Stranding 2's story, mostly with the pacing in the early hours of the game, as Death Stranding 2 ironically suffers from the opposite problem as the first game, as the early hours of Death Stranding 2 move extremely quickly, which as I mentioned before, makes some of Sam's behaviours feel unnatural. As much as I love Kojima, his grasp on human emotion has always been a little shaky. Sometimes he'll emotionally destroy you with one of the most gut-wrenching scenes you've ever witnessed in a game. Other times, you'll be left thinking, no human would ever act or talk like this. And that remains firmly true here. There were moments where something Sam said would absolutely kill me in Death Stranding 2. Like when he first spots the hulking robotic ghost mechs and says, "Who the fuck are those guys?" Or when a cybernetic ninja shows up and saves Sam from said ghost mechs before disappearing, and Sam mutters, "What was his deal?" It's so silly, but it's also deeply charming to me. And to give credit where it's due, Death Stranding 2's story is better told than the original Death Stranding in just about every way. The writing is sharper, the performances are even better, and the camera work feels more lively and creative, be it the wide camera shots that show you the sheer scope of the environments, or the shots made to mimic a handheld camera following the cast, all of which add to the cinematic feel, making Death Stranding 2's cutscenes more absorbing. But while I think DS2's story is great, and worthy of a lot of praise, I still prefer the overarching narrative of the original Death Stranding. The final stretch of that game just hits so hard for me. The only other issue I have with the story of Death Stranding 2 is one that I'd never expected to have with a Kojima game, which is that I found Death Stranding 2's story fairly predictable. Within the early hours, I had clocked 2 of the 3 major twists in Death Stranding 2, and was just waiting for them to be revealed. In fact, I'd put together the biggest one from what we'd seen in marketing before ever touching the game, and I was sure I must be wrong, and that Kojima was going to pull some kind of twist on those twists. But no, this is just an uncharacteristically predictable story from Kojima. Though that's not a huge problem. A lot of stories are predictable. It doesn't make the story beats any less impactful if they're executed well. And for the most part, Death Stranding 2 is an exceptionally well-told story. And this is a story that just keeps escalating and getting more chaotic and exciting the deeper in you get. The final section of Death Stranding 2 is one of the most grandiose spectacles I've ever witnessed in a game, and I was grinning like a moron as I took it all in. What made me fall in love with the first Death Stranding was its wonderful assortment of characters. I truly think characters like Cliff, Fragile, and Hartman are among the best Kojima has ever created, and the cast of Death Stranding 2 is just as strong, if not stronger. The returning characters are expanded on beautifully here, with Léa Seydoux once more crushing the role of Fragile. And I've gotta say, I liked Sam even more in Death Stranding 2 than I did in the first game, and a large part of that is because I really empathised with him here. We learn a lot more about Sam and his history in Death Stranding 2, and I felt genuinely awful for him throughout a lot of this game. Sam is someone who's been used, manipulated by, and trampled on by the people around him over and over again through no real fault of his own. I once more found Norman Reedus' performance fascinating, because he remains far more subdued and subtle than his castmates, but as I said before, it makes sense, because you need that more grounded character in this outlandish world to serve as a stand-in for the audience. It also makes sense for Sam to have a more timid personality. He's meant to be a character who's disconnected and withdrawn. After all, the man spent the first game contending with a phobia of being touched. Speaking of characters I enjoyed even more in Death Stranding 2 than in the first game, we also have Troy Baker's Higgs once more returning as our primary antagonist in Death Stranding 2. I liked Higgs in the original Death Stranding, but I was blown away by him here. Death Stranding 2 takes Higgs to another level, and earns him a spot among the pantheon of all-time great video game villains. I think this is one of the best performances Troy Baker has ever given, and that is really saying something. At the end of Death Stranding 1, Fragile had left Higgs in quite the predicament, to say the least, stranded by himself on the beach. As we know from Hartman, time passes differently on the beaches than it does in our world. So while only 11 months have passed for the rest of the cast, it's been an eternity for Higgs. And from our first encounter with Higgs in Death Stranding 2, you can tell that this isolation has completely broken Higgs, and he's even more psychotic and sadistic than the Higgs we knew before. Seriously, Higgs is the pure embodiment of evil in this game. He might be one of the most monstrous villains to ever exist. Higgs already had quite a heightened personality in the original Death Stranding, to put it lightly. But Death Stranding 2 takes his theatrics to another level, with Higgs rising from a mechanical coffin every time he shows up, and fighting enemies with a lightning-shooting electric guitar. And don't worry, we get a lot of that freaking guitar. And no, it never stops being cool. There's even a hint of Troy's Joker performance in Higgs this time around, which seems appropriate as the guy's even got the white face paint now. Of course, Death Stranding 2 also massively expands our core crew of characters, with Sam working alongside a new team of wonderfully absurd characters at Drawbridge, consisting of captain and pilot of the DHV Magellan, the ship we travelled across the tar currents to Australia in, the aptly titled Tarman. And to guide us to Australia, we needed a true blue Aussie icon. So Tarman's appearance is based on the legendary director and creator of Mad Max, George Miller. Though as you'd probably guess, he's not voiced by him. Kojima loves cramming in cameos of directors he likes, much like Heartman using Nicholas Winding Refn's likeness, and Deadman using Guillermo del Toro's. Tarman is such a Kojima-ass character. If you're wondering why he's the pilot of our ship, it's simple. You see, he's the best person to guide us through the tar currents that cover the Earth, because his right hand got severed and is in the tar, so he can feel the currents and therefore knows how to best navigate them. Oh, and he's also accompanied by a bat-winged tar cat, which, no, isn't really ever addressed. It's just here as a quirky addition. God, I love Kojima. Then we have Charlie, the anonymous benefactor of the DHV Magellan, who's hired Sam and the rest of the crew to connect Australia for reasons unknown. As Charlie is concealing his identity, he only appears to you in the form of a mannequin, which uses the voice of Die Hardman, or in animated pop-ups where he shows up looking like Professor X. Rainey, who quickly became one of my favourite characters in this universe. Rainey, would you believe, controls the rain, bringing the Timefall rain with her wherever she goes. Yes, I know it's very on the nose, but roll with it. Rainey is in many ways the heart of our crew. She's a consistently cheery, kind person, despite potentially being the most tragic character in this story. Rainey has been shunned and persecuted her whole life because she unintentionally brings the Timefall wherever she goes, but she's also the key to fixing the damage done by the Timefall, as she projects a field around her immediate vicinity that reverses the effects of the Timefall, restoring destroyed objects and healing the creatures harmed by the Timefall. As if her very existence wasn't cruel enough, the pregnant Rainey is also afflicted with something called still baby syndrome, meaning that due to the chaos unfolding in Death Stranding's world, her pregnancy is stuck at 8 months, with her baby alive and well, but no longer growing, meaning she's forced to carry this child indefinitely, as any attempt to remove an infant in this state leads to their death. Despite carrying this weight, she remains the most optimistic and empathetic member of Drawbridge. Rainey is just such an endearing character from the moment you meet her, and her actress, Shioli Kutsuna, who is probably best known for playing Yukio in the Deadpool movies, does a phenomenal job bringing her to life. One character we saw a lot of in the marketing for DS2 is the enigmatic Tomorrow, played by Elle Fanning. She's a character I can't say much about, as she's intentionally shrouded in mystery throughout the majority of the game, with both the crew of Drawbridge and Tomorrow herself not even knowing who exactly Tomorrow is or where she came from. But what I will say is that I loved Tomorrow, and I think she's the scene stealer of this game. While Higgs gives her a run for her money, Tomorrow has the coolest action sequences in Death Stranding 2. If you watched Kojima's presentation for Death Stranding 2 at South by Southwest, you saw the incredible cutscene he showed off of Tomorrow using her powers to dip in and out of the tar currents as she zooms around and single-handedly takes down an entire platoon of ghost mechs. This sequence is incredible, with the impeccable choreography and dynamic camera work making this one of the best fight scenes in not just a game, but any piece of entertainment released in 2025. Finally, we have one of the breakout stars of the trailers, Doll Man, who, wouldn't you know, is a doll with a man's spirit or car trapped inside it. Yes, once again I know it's absurd, but trust me, he's great. Doll Man is animated differently to every other character in the game, and moves in that Onto style of animation, almost a little like the Spider-Verse movies, a touch to separate him from the human characters that I loved. Doll Man is attached at the hip to Sam throughout Death Stranding 2, and I mean that quite literally, as Sam keeps him dangling on his belt clip whenever he's out in the field, so you'll be spending a lot of time with Doll Man, and whenever Sam is resting up in a shelter, or in his room aboard the DHV Magellan, you're able to chat with Doll Man, and you absolutely should at every opportunity, because he has plenty of interesting information to dole out, whether it be unpacking recent events in the story, opening up about his own tragic history, or hitting you with cute little fourth wall breaks. The guy literally mentions Elle Fanning by name at one point. But it absolutely kills me that there are books in Sam's room, and whenever you pick one up to read it, Doll Man will just tell Sam everything that happens in the book, completely spoiling the story for Sam. Dick move, Doll Man. Naturally, the new cast members extend well beyond the crew of Drawbridge, and if you saw the trailers for Death Stranding 2, you'll already be familiar with two more of them, Neil Varner and his psychiatrist, Lucy, with Neil being played by Luca Marinelli, an actor Kojima once said would be the spitting image of Snake if he donned a bandana. And in a cheeky nod, yes, we have him donning a bandana and modelled to look conspicuously like Snake in Death Stranding 2. Most of Neil's story revolves around his relationship with Lucy, and like Tomorrow, Neil is a character veiled in secrecy, so I won't say too much about him. I'll just say that he essentially serves the same role that Mads Mikkelsen's Cliff did in the original Death Stranding, where we're gradually unravelling his story across the entire game by piecing together the breadcrumbs we get from flashbacks whenever Sam plugs into the BB tank. As Kojima chose to show some of these moments in the trailers, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that like the cliff sequences in Death Stranding 1 that took place in historical battlefields, Sam's encounters with Neil take place within a liminal space that, like the beaches, exists somewhere between life and death. And these sequences are jaw-dropping. There's a sequence in one of these sections that was shown in Death Stranding 2's pre-order trailer, where you're walking through these gloomy European streets as fireworks erupt all around you, and it might be the most visually stunning thing I've ever seen in a video game. My god, just look at this! Kojima's out here making a PS6 game. This whole sequence feels like such a flex by Kojima Productions. I can see why Kojima likes Luca so much. The man's got incredible acting chops. I've got to be honest, I didn't know anything about Luca Marinelli going into this game. I don't think I've seen a single film he's in, but he is phenomenal in Death Stranding 2. With that said, while I do think Neil's story is fascinating, by the time it wrapped up, it didn't hit as hard for me as Cliff's story did in the first game. Though Cliff is an incredible character played by one of the greatest living actors, so I guess it'd be hard for anything to live up to that bar. Kojima Productions does an incredible job of getting you invested in the entire cast throughout Death Stranding 2. Not only through the major cutscenes, but through the smaller interactions you witness with the cast as you chat with Doll Man in Sam's room or run into Rainey and Tomorrow on the way to the showers. Death Stranding 2 is just filled with little interactions that help build out its characters. When Final Fantasy XVI released a couple of years back, I gushed about its real-time lore system, which allowed you to bring up an encyclopedia mid-cutscene to learn more about the places, factions, and terminology of that game's world, which was such a clever way of keeping players up to speed in a game that had a complex world filled with political intrigue and fantastical lore. And I remember saying that it's an idea more games should adopt. Well, Death Stranding 2 has done just that, implementing a similar system called the Corpus, where when certain phrases come up during cutscenes, you're able to press a button to read a definition of them, which is very convenient in a game with as much made-up jargon as Death Stranding. I'm sure it'll come in especially handy if you haven't played the first game in a while and need a refresher to jog your memory at certain points in Death Stranding 2. The biggest improvements to Death Stranding 2 over its predecessor are all found within its gameplay. The core gameplay loop of Death Stranding 2 remains largely unchanged. You're still ultimately delivering all varieties of packages to people in shelters, be it life-saving medicine or just a nice hot pizza. But it's not hyperbole to say that every aspect of gameplay has been refined here. If you absolutely loathed the original Death Stranding 2 isn't likely to turn you around. The micromanagement heavy gameplay of organising cargo, showering after a trek, and checking how worn down your shoes are isn't for everyone. However, if you were into the premise of Death Stranding, but had issues with how slow and plodding Death Stranding could be in its early hours, I think Death Stranding 2 will fully pull you into this universe, and you might be surprised how much this loop scratches a specific part of your brain the right way. It's instantly noticeable that Death Stranding 2's gameplay is substantially better paced than its predecessor. Death Stranding 2 doles out essential gear much faster than the first game, which makes it easier to get into the flow of gameplay early on. The opening hours of Death Stranding could be grueling, as you were given very little of the equipment needed to speed up deliveries and deal with the threats you faced in the environment. But Death Stranding 2 gives you access to vehicles, cargo carriers, and the support skeletons that allow you to carry heavier cargo, move faster, and automatically stabilise yourself in harsh terrain much earlier on, so you feel more empowered from the jump, and don't have to overcome such a steep learning curve. Once again, I thoroughly enjoyed the loop of plotting out my journeys and finding the most efficient ways to get cargo from point A to B here. Just like in the first Death Stranding, your performance as a porter is graded after each delivery, with your rank primarily being determined by the condition the cargo is in by the time you get it to its recipient. Though how long it takes you to deliver the cargo is also a factor for certain deliveries. I found it far easier to get S ranks for most deliveries from the jump in Death Stranding 2, largely because you're given access to vehicles so much faster here than in Death Stranding 1, and if you're tossing the packages in the back of a truck and driving them to their destination, you're far less likely to accidentally damage them, as you're not going to end up slipping down a hill or accidentally falling into a river. Vehicles play a bigger role throughout Death Stranding 2 than they did in the first game. While you're still using the same trucks and trikes around Australia in Death Stranding 2, you're given more opportunities to customise them to make them better suited for different terrain. You can equip your vehicles with weapons, extra batteries, new tyres with grips that help the vehicle climb steep terrain, and armour plating to protect your vehicle from enemy gunfire. You can even give your truck grabber claws, which automatically shoot out and grab any piece of lost cargo you drive past, so you don't have to hop out to pick it up, which is such a wonderful quality of life inclusion that dramatically speeds up the end game grind. You're also free to customise the look of your trucks and trikes at any base, changing their paint jobs and giving them custom decals. I often found myself torn between which vehicle to use in Death Stranding 2, because while I love the trikes and prefer the feel of driving them over trucks, both because of how fast they are, and because their lean size means they can fit through narrow crevices that the trucks can get stuck in, the massive amount of storage space a truck affords you is just too convenient to turn down a lot of the time. Whenever I was in a truck, I would just load it up with every piece of lost cargo I found along the way, knowing it was there to drop off when I inevitably returned to the outpost it belonged to. Oh, while I'm on the topic of vehicles, it's also worth noting that there's some light vehicle combat in Death Stranding 2, as you can load your vehicles up with turrets and use them to take down enemy vehicles and combatants. In one of the trailers for Death Stranding 2, we saw a spectacular motorcycle chase sequence, and I was shocked to find that this moment is actually a part of a side mission and is totally missable. So heads up, always keep an eye out for interesting sounding side mission descriptions, or at the very least, check out a guide to make sure you don't miss out on this one, because it is fantastic. Making deliveries was tricky in the first Death Stranding, because you were fighting to navigate the environments with very little equipment for the first half of the game. But it can be a lot more complicated for an entirely different reason this time around: the weather. One of the big new systems Kojima Productions has introduced in Death Stranding 2 is dynamic weather and environmental disasters. When out on a mission in Death Stranding 2, you might encounter a bushfire raging through the scrublands, downpours that cause the water levels of rivers to rise, making them dangerous to wade through, a massive electrical storm bearing down lightning and intense winds that requires you to shelter against solid structures, sand and snowstorms that limit visibility, and the aforementioned plate quakes that cause landslides that can send massive rocks plunging towards you while making your way up a mountain. And Kojima Productions makes excellent use of the DualSense haptics in these moments, letting you feel the pitter-patter of raindrops and the violent shake of the plate quakes. Eventually, you are given tools to deal with some of these events, like the tar cannon which can extinguish raging flames, but the world never loses its pervasive sense of danger, which keeps the deliveries exciting whether you're 8 or 80 hours in. The dynamic weather events are such a wonderful addition, and add a layer of complete unpredictability and spectacle to Death Stranding 2's gameplay, making the world feel so much more alive than the original Death Stranding. But it's not the only reason the world feels more fleshed out and alive here. That's also thanks to the addition of a day-night cycle, something that was conspicuously absent in the original Death Stranding, and all the Aussie wildlife roaming around the map. And Sam can even capture these animals and safely transport them to a wildlife reserve. Think of an iconic Australian animal, and you'll probably find it in Death Stranding 2. There are kangaroos, koalas, emus, echidnas, wombats, and quokkas, which we'll let slide because of how adorable they are. But come on, Kojima, quokkas shouldn't be on the mainland. They're only found on Rottnest Island because they have no natural predators there. So much attention to detail has been put into the toll the harsh environments of Death Stranding 2 take on Sam. Sam can get sunburnt if he's out walking under the sun for extended periods, frostbite if you're moving through snow without wearing adequately warm clothing, and if you're climbing a mountain, you'll need to put on an oxygen mask, as when the air gets too thin at high altitudes, Sam can pass out. As silly as it might sound, all of this makes Death Stranding 2's world feel tangible, real, and immersive. There are 42 facilities to bring into the chiral network and deliver packages to in Death Stranding 2, each of which has its own individual connection level, which you increase by completing jobs for its inhabitants, returning their lost cargo that you find lying around in the world, or recovering their stolen deliveries from the lockers of mule camps. So needless to say, there's a lot of work to be done in Death Stranding 2 if you want to get your connection level with each facility to 5 stars. And you'll want to put in at least a little extra work with each facility, as increasing your connection level level with different facilities is how you unlock all the different gear, weapons, and cosmetics for Sam. Death Stranding 2's Platinum was a grind, and if you're planning to 100% Death Stranding 2, you're looking at least 100 hours of playtime. Just like in the original Death Stranding, the survivors that man the shelters are often cameos of different celebrities and games industry insiders that Kojima has taken a liking to. In Death Stranding, you'd find yourself delivering packages to Conan O'Brien, Jordan Vogt Roberts, Jeff Keighley, Sam Lake, and my favourite director, Edgar Wright. This time around, you'll come across more of Kojima's friends and inspirations, including Midnight Mass and Dr. Sleep director Mike Flanagan, Woodkid, a musician who contributed heavily to Death Stranding 2's soundtrack, as well as former YouTubers and Talk to Me and Bring Her Back directors Danny and Michael Philippou. You've gotta love seeing some actual Aussies populating Australia in DS2. And just like with the first game, Kojima has come up with plenty of bizarre and unexpected personas to assign these guests, my favourite of which has to be turning Ghost in the Shell director Mamoru Oshii into a post-apocalyptic pizza chef. There are of course plenty of video game industry insiders scattered around Death Stranding 2 as well, but they're definitely deeper cuts this time around and won't necessarily be as recognisable to most players. While in DS1 you were finding people like Keighley, Sam Lake and Herman Holst, the industry insiders in DS2 are pulled largely from the corporate side rather than the creative side. People like Craig Malunka, who's the Vice President of Global Marketing for Sony Interactive Entertainment. As you'd expect, making deliveries becomes more and more trivial the deeper you get into Death Stranding 2, both because you're unlocking enhanced gear that lets you transport cargo more efficiently, and because you're building infrastructure in the world that makes it easier to get around. Like the first Death Stranding 2 allows you to construct roads throughout Australia, allowing you to both bypass tricky terrain that your vehicle would normally struggle on, and also save your vehicle's precious battery power, as battery isn't consumed when you're driving on roads. Building out the roads in the original Death Stranding could be a tedious, grindy process, but Death Stranding 2 makes securing the materials needed for construction a lot simpler, thanks to the mining sites on the map that you can set up and use to automatically farm for resources. And even before you build out the roads, things will start becoming easier when you repeatedly revisit the same areas, as Death Stranding 2 has a hidden mechanic where if you and other players continue to drive over the same patch of land repeatedly, eventually the terrain will be flattened out and the rocks and trees in the area will be cleared, creating something of a natural road. But Death Stranding 2 offers an even more convenient way to move cargo than roads, through its awesome monorail system. As you make your way across Australia, you can build out a massive monorail network across the entire continent, which you can then use to transport massive quantities of materials from place to place in one trip. You can even have Sam hop aboard it so you can soak in the beautiful views. Once again, it's the communal experience at the core of Death Stranding 2 that makes the game so special. Knowing that everyone is playing their part in making this world a little better, as you benefit from other people's creations, grab a vehicle built by another player when you've lost your own, and all contribute to the construction of big community projects like the roads and monorail tracks. And it's a nice feeling to know that all of your creations are also helping your fellow players when you log out of the game and return a couple of days later to find a bridge over a stream or a generator in the middle of a desert you've built has accrued tens of thousands of likes from other players who have benefited from it. There's just nothing else remotely like Death Stranding, a completely solo experience where the online connection remains completely pivotal to the experience. The areas of gameplay that have been the most drastically expanded on in Death Stranding 2 are the combat and stealth mechanics. The combat of the first Death Stranding was undeniably rough, and was easily the weakest aspect of the game for me, but combat is infinitely better here. I was shocked by just how much I enjoyed the shootouts in DS2, though it was crucial that Kojima Productions nailed down the combat this time around, as Death Stranding 2 is significantly heavier on action set pieces and combat than the first game. The melee, gunplay, and stealth mechanics are all far more robust here, and you're usually given the option to approach enemy encounters in any way you like. You'll regularly find yourself having to infiltrate enemy camps, and it's up to you whether you want to slowly sneak through their camp, picking enemies off one by one with a silenced pistol and tying them up with your strand, or going in there guns blazing, lobbing grenades, and mowing down every last enemy with a machine gun. You can even equip a pair of power gloves, charge in, and beat the shit out of enemies while blocking and parrying their blows, and all of these options feel surprisingly great. As I came upon bases, scoped them out, marking every enemy on the map before setting foot anywhere near it, then picked off the enemies on the edges with a tranq sniper, before heading in and silently taking out each enemy with the maser gun, I was immediately taken back to playing Metal Gear Solid 5 in 2015, and I mean that as the highest compliment possible. I put 200 hours into MGS5, because despite its story being incomplete and messy, to this day, I think the Phantom Pain has the best stealth gameplay to ever grace a video game. God, I love that game, and I know I'm going to get hopelessly sucked into it all over again when the Master Collection Volume 2 inevitably includes it. Seriously, anyone who tries to call Death Stranding 2 a walking simulator is either totally disingenuous or plain stupid. Death Stranding 2's encounters never get tiresome because you're given such an enormous array of tools to play around with in its sandbox, including gadgets like holo grenades that create projections of Sam to distract enemies, a projector that creates a hologram of a BT to cause panic amongst the enemies, or you can even toss Dollman into the middle of a camp, then switch to his view to locate enemies. And your gargantuan assortment of weapons ranges from sniper rifles, to assault rifles, to shotguns, to pistols, to grenade launchers. Of course, it wouldn't be a Kojima game if you weren't given plenty of non-lethal options as well. So not only does Death Stranding 2 see the return of the bowler gun that binds enemies, and the maser gun that shocks enemies, but nearly every firearm has an unlockable non-lethal counterpart too. There are also a couple of truly awesome melee weapons you can snag off of enemies in Death Stranding 2 that I won't ruin for you. Let's just say, Death Stranding 2's weapons can get very Metal Gear. And unlike the first Death Stranding, which really made you work for the good stuff, you're given powerful weapons straight away in 2, so you don't feel like you're at such a disadvantage in the early hours. You'll need to take full advantage of every weapon in your arsenal in DS2, as different weapons are suited to different enemies. While a tranq sniper is useful for knocking out an entire base of human soldiers, it's not going to do much to a BT. For them, you're going to want to use an MP assault rifle, blood grenades, or one of the new weapons on offer in Death Stranding 2, the blood boomerang. Because you know Kojima couldn't resist including a boomerang in a game set in Australia. Holding down the right trigger while you have the boomerang equipped will fill it with Sam's blood, allowing him to stealthily take out standard BTs in one hit. I gotta say, Sam's pretty damn proficient with that boomerang, and that's no easy feat. I think every Australian child has had that sad realisation at some point that boomerangs don't actually work like they do in cartoons, and are actually pretty tricky to throw properly. So when you try throwing one, it normally just flies 15 metres before unceremoniously crashing into the ground. Death Stranding 2 also offers entirely new enemy types to contend with outside of humans and BTs, with one of the most commonly encountered being the robotic ghost mechs that we saw extensively in DS2's trailers. Ghost mechs are heavily armoured, which means they're incredibly resilient to damage. If you're only dealing with a couple of them, sure, you can get by with a pistol or machine gun, but you're often swarmed by these enemies, and when that happens, you're going to need shotguns, rocket launchers, and grenades to deal enough damage to take them out before they overwhelm you. Thankfully, you've got ample opportunities to get acquainted with your arsenal of weapons and gadgets, as Death Stranding 2 has an array of VR missions that you can tackle aboard the DHV Magellan, so you're well prepared to deal with these enemies when you encounter the real deal. The VR missions are so fun, and of course, lifted right out of the classic Metal Gear games. I always loved taking on the VR missions in MGS 1 and 2, so I was quick to jump into the VR room whenever I got a notification to let me know new VR missions were available. I was glad to see the VR missions included from the jump here, and not added down the line like they were with the first game's director's cut. Death Stranding 2 gives you more options to customise Sam than its predecessor, both physically and when it comes to his stats and skills. You can swap between different outfits, many of which have camo patterns that can help you blend in better in specific terrains, and you can customise Sam's backpack with pouches to hold extra grenades, ammo, and blood bags. You can also add some extra visual flair with the patches you unlock throughout the story. Many of Sam's skills improve naturally as you play without you having to actively manage them, as Death Stranding 2 has a levelling system akin to the Elder Scrolls games, where repeatedly using different abilities will improve Sam's proficiency in them. Sam's combat prowess increases the more he fights, running frequently will increase his stamina, and carrying heavy loads of items will gradually increase Sam's carry capacity. But Death Stranding 2 also allows you to upgrade Sam more directly through its Opus enhancement system, which serves as Death Stranding 2's skill tree, allowing you to upgrade Sam's traversal, stealth, and combat capabilities, with different nodes of the Opus enhancement tree improving the speed and range of Sam's terrain scanner, dampening the sound of his footsteps, increasing the damage of MP bullets against BTs, and even unlocking the ability to automatically bind the cargo Sam is carrying if he falls to prevent it from scattering all over the place. And the best part about this skill tree? You're able to reallocate points freely at any time, so if you don't like a skill or think you'd be better off with some different abilities for a specific situation, you can just swap your skill points around with no penalties. When you think of Kojima games, if you're anything like me, one of the first things that comes to your mind is boss fights. Metal Gear Solid 1 to 4 are home to some truly legendary boss fights, with the fights against characters like Psycho Mantis, Liquid Ocelot, The End, Fat Man, and the Boss being some of the most memorable boss fights in gaming. But the boss fights in the first Death Stranding were a massive disappointment to me. Nearly all of them just saw you lobbing dozens of blood grenades at samey looking BTs, while you slowly trudged through sludge, trying to get onto the ruins of buildings where you could move around a little more freely. Thankfully, Death Stranding 2's boss fights are another massive area of improvement over the first game. While most might not live up to the bosses found in the glory days of Metal Gear Solid, the boss fights in Death Stranding 2 are still a lot of fun. While the BT fights follow the same structure here, they're vastly better to play thanks to the refinements to combat and the fact that you're given powerful tools to combat BTs much earlier on in Death Stranding 2. I would be frustrated whenever I was dragged into a fight with a BT in Death Stranding 1, but in Death Stranding 2, with a bag of grenades on my backpack and an assault rifle loaded with blood bullets, I knew that I was well equipped to take down any BT threat that came my way. Several boss fights in Death Stranding 2 see you taking on different mechanical monstrosities. One highlight early on sees you fighting a tentacled machine, with you blasting off each of its limbs to bring it to its knees. And while fairly simplistic and traditional, these boss fights are still incredibly satisfying, and certainly leagues better than anything you'll find in the original Death Stranding. Now, a second ago, I said most of Death Stranding 2's boss fights are not as good as what you'd find in the classic Metal Gear games for a reason. Because while most are not, there is one fight near the end of Death Stranding 2 that is truly incredible. I obviously won't give any details about it, but this spectacle-filled fight is nothing short of epic. It's Kojima at his most creative, absurd, and magnificent. And I'm so glad I have a save file at this point, because I know it's a fight I'll want to revisit when I need a pure, undiluted hit of Kojima goodness. I mentioned earlier when talking about the Nirvana encounters, how visually stunning Death Stranding 2 can be, but it cannot be overstated just how gorgeous this game is. Death Stranding 2 is one of the best, if not the best looking game I've ever played. It certainly has the most impressive environments I've ever encountered in a game. I was constantly going into photo mode to take screenshots of Death Stranding 2's beautiful, serene landscapes. The lighting in Death Stranding 2 is unreal. When you walk across a mountain and see the rising sunlight begin to peek through the gaps, it's so lifelike, it's breathtaking. There are moments where Death Stranding 2 will let you switch to an aerial camera so you can truly soak in the beauty of its picturesque locales, and every time I did, I was left slack-jawed by how good Death Stranding 2 looks. The same is true of Death Stranding 2's character models, which are brought to life with some of the most impressive and lifelike motion capture and animation work I've ever seen. There's that moment shown in one of Death Stranding 2's trailers where Sam and Fragile kiss, and this is something games often struggle to make look natural, and not like two character models clumsily bumping into each other. But in Death Stranding 2, the way their noses contort as they brush up against each other looks so convincing, and it's this unbelievable level of photorealism that allows Death Stranding 2 to bring to life actors we know so well, like Lea Seydoux and Norman Reedus, without ever dipping into Uncanny Valley territory. I'm honestly convinced Death Stranding 2 has that bizarre photo mode where you perform photo shoots with the crew of the DHV Magellan purely so Kojima Productions can further show off how great their character models look. And Death Stranding 2 is filled with so many interesting visual flourishes, like the way everything and everyone aboard the DHV Magellan turns chromatic when you're travelling below the tar currents, or the image becoming mirrored as whales swim through the sky as Sam approaches and passes through the plate gates. Death Stranding 2 is just a visual feast at every moment you're playing it. In a day and age where we're seeing endless problems caused by different engines, looking at you Unreal Engine 5, Death Stranding 2 is another incredible showcase of Guerrilla's powerhouse Decima engine, with DS2 offering not just utterly gorgeous visuals, but rock-solid performance too. Kojima's games have long had immaculate art direction, thanks in no small part to Kojima's long-time working relationship with the great Yoji Shinkawa, who designed the characters and machines of the Metal Gear Solid series, as well as the first Death Stranding. And Yoji Shinkawa once more leads the charge of art direction in Death Stranding 2, and man did Shinkawa and the rest of the art team pop off here. The mechanical enemies, vehicles like the DHV Magellan, the horrific new BTs that look like hand spiders and tar jellyfish, the outfits, the weird hand mask Fragile uses for everything from shielding her face to lighting her cigarettes. Every little thing you see in this game is so striking and distinctly Death Stranding. Likewise, Death Stranding 2's music is also unsurprisingly superb. After all, we know Kojima loves to curate a selection of music from the finest musicians to accompany his games. Though I will say, I still think Clair Obscur is a shoo-in for best soundtrack of 2025. As was the case with DS1, Death Stranding 2 is filled with amazing needle drops that will suddenly kick in as you're making your way through the environment, adding so much additional emotional gravity as you approach an unfamiliar destination or absorb the consequences of a dramatic cutscene. The major musical star this time around is Woodkid, with Woodkid's dulcet vocals helping to sell the sorrowful tone of Death Stranding 2. I'm always so fascinated by the music Kojima latches onto, and there's one song that plays a recurring role throughout Death Stranding 2, which was even included in the trailer, with that song being Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. Was this song chosen for interesting thematic reasons? Yes. Did it make me think of Spider-Man 2 every time it played? Also yes. Once again, as you wander the world, you'll also be able to listen to a selection of tracks from artists from across the world. Though my metalcore loving arse was a little let down that we didn't get a new Bring Me the Horizon song in Death Stranding 2, after the banger that is Ludens being featured in the first Death Stranding. As a matter of fact, there's not a single heavy song on this soundtrack. Step it up, Kojima. I'm not asking for a lot, but you know, one metalcore or deathcore song in your game, please. I see your tweets. I know you've listened to Lorna Shore. Get them in there. But in all seriousness, while it's not necessarily filled with songs that I want to listen to outside of the game, Death Stranding 2's soundtrack is very good, and complements the game beautifully. I was also pleasantly surprised to see the continued use of a lot of low roar, whose music was incredibly prevalent in the first game and really helped solidify Death Stranding's identity. But after the band's founder and frontman, Ryan Kuradzija, tragically passed away a couple of years back, I wasn't sure if their music would be featured in Death Stranding 2, but Kojima continues to show his love for the band here, with the inclusion of music released posthumously, and the game is even dedicated to Ryan, which was a classy touch. Death Stranding 2's use of music is sublime, but one nitpick I have is the sound mix here. I think the mixing is a little off throughout Death Stranding 2. There were moments where things seemed way too loud, then the next minute I'd be struggling to hear what characters were saying, so I found myself constantly reaching for the remote to turn the volume up and down while playing Death Stranding 2. With Death Stranding 2, Kojima has delivered a triumphant career highlight. While it won't resonate with everyone, and hell, I certainly wouldn't recommend it to everyone, if you're willing to settle in for a slower, deliberately paced, and deeply strange game, you're going to be rewarded with one of the most unique and oddly satisfying video game experiences you'll ever have. Death Stranding 2 is everything you want a sequel to be. The world and characters are even more unashamedly ludicrous, and the gameplay has been improved in every imaginable way, with Death Stranding 2 playing into the strengths of the original while refining its weaker points by drastically improving the stealth, combat, and boss fights. Death Stranding 2 is also drop-dead gorgeous and offers another excellent soundtrack curated by Kojima. This will probably be an unpopular opinion, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but Death Stranding 2 has surpassed Clair Obscur as my game of the year. Kojima's games just have a unique magic to them. He has that special touch. I've never played a game of his that I disliked. I truly believe Death Stranding 2 is one of the best games of Kojima's storied career, and it's already secured its place among my favourite games of all time. What can I say? I love Kojima's games like Kojima loves Jeff Keighley. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other reviews on my channel, including my recent reviews of Mario Kart World and Doom the Dark Ages. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of Donkey Kong Bonanza, Ninja Gaiden Ragebound, and Demon Slayer The Hinokami Chronicles 2. Till next time, be well guys.